in global health. With a mandate to facilitate the translation of research evidence into policies and tangible actions, UNU IIGH serves as a hub connecting UN member states, policymakers, academia, agencies, and programs. At the beginning of this year, we launched our new institutional strategy. As part of our overarching aim to address inequalities in global health, we initiated a program of work on power and accountability. 3 weeks ago, we began this webinar series by unpacking how we define global health governance, the features of good global health governance, and the importance of accountability as a core feature. If you missed that conversation, you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel or read the accompanying working paper. For our second webinar, I'm joined today by 4 fantastic panelists, Chi Yok Ling, Suri Moon, Sharifa Sekalala, and Peter Singer. With expertise spanning the global health ecosystem, together we'll start to unpack the gradual shift towards complex multilateralism and its implications for multi-stakeholderism within global health governance. With experiences spanning the UN, civil society, and academia, they'll provide a window into the system, as well as reflections on the broader forces at play, illustrating how attempts to be more inclusive can be hijacked or co-opted, and how power asymmetries can be replicated or indeed exacerbated within the very mechanisms created to confront them. We have a lot that we want to cover today, and so rather than giving you a full rundown of all of their achievements, we'll be sharing full speaker bios in the chat throughout the discussion. Similarly, we're keen to know who you are and where you're joining from. So please do use the chat box to tell us your name and to share any reflections from the discussion. And if you have any questions from our panelists, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering some of those later on in the discussion. And just before I pass over to Suri, a huge thank you to those of you who submitted your questions ahead of time. They arranged a fantastic kind of range of topics, and we've pre-shared those with our panelists. So hopefully you'll hear some of your questions answered already, and we'll be addressing more as we work through today's session. And now, without further ado, I introduce our first speaker for today, Suri Moon. Suri, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Before I dive in, I really wanted to thank you, David, Sylvia, Tiffany, the whole team at UNU IIGH for inviting us and pulling together this conversation on a topic that I think is very, very timely and on which we generally don't spend enough time, which is indeed about global health governance, power disparities, and accountability. And I also want to congratulate and express my great enthusiasm for the new strategy, indeed, that was launched earlier this year that focuses squarely on these themes. What I'd like to do in the next 5 or 6 minutes is kind of lay out some opening framing comments and talk about the origins of the current global health system and its governance, make a few comments about accountability mechanisms, how well they're working, and challenges to them, and last but not least, draw on a few concrete examples from the recent pandemic agreement negotiations that are continuing, all in about 5 minutes. And Emma, please feel free to jump in and cut me off if I start to go on and on. So first, a few words about the origins of the system that we have today. And I think many of you who are watching and are on this call are also very knowledgeable already about this system. But we've transitioned over the last 20 or 30 years from a system that used to be primarily a system of states, an intergovernmental system where it was governments and intergovernmental organizations like WHO that were really the main players, to a much more complex, diverse system where we have many, many more non-state actors. And I think this has both strengths and weaknesses when we think about power disparities and challenges for governance and accountability. I think, as people will know very well, we have foundations, civil society groups, academics, private sector, religious groups, professional associations, and on and on and on. And this new complexity in terms of who are the players around the table indeed raises lots and lots of challenges, especially for actors with fewer resources. But a second major shift over the last 30 years has been not only from intergovernmental to multi-stakeholder, but also from a system in which we have focused primarily on the health sector to a system where we also realize we have to look at governance processes taking place in many, many other sectors, right? Whether that's the trade arena, environment, migration, agriculture, human rights, etc. The understanding that governance processes happening at the global level outside the health sector have profound effects on health, I think, has been growing over the last 30 years, and the need to engage and to learn how to manage health threats in multiple sectors, again, raises new challenges for complexity and can sometimes exacerbate power disparities. I think the third big shift we've seen over the last 30 years is perhaps a bit more optimistic, actually, and I'll take the risk of being somewhat optimistic today. And that's to say, I think we had in many ways a more unequal world before if we look at it through the lens of countries, right? That inequalities between countries in many ways have been decreasing because of economic development and sort of an overall power shift away from just a handful of high-income countries. And that this is a trend that's continuing with really profound consequences, I would say, for efforts at global health governance. So in some ways, indeed, a more even distribution of power. And I think one of the factoids that is often not well known is that China supplied more COVID-19 vaccines to developing countries than the COVAX initiative did in the first 2 years after vaccines became available, for better or for worse. And of course, we can all have a long debate about the implications of that. But this is, I think, a signal of an important power shift. All of this complexity and all of these changes absolutely raise difficulties for accountability. But when we think about accountability, I think it's important that we think about from whom to whom. And the big question used to be accountability of states, of governments to populations overall. Today, I think the question is accountability of states. That's still a big question, but also of non-state actors to anyone whose health can be affected by the decisions of many, many different non-state actors. And I think what's clear is that accountability relationships are much more diffuse, arguably weaker, more difficult to follow and to act in than they were before. To me, what has always been central to accountability has been transparency. These often go hand in hand. We often say them in the same breath. And of course, in many ways, we have more transparency than ever before with information flowing so quickly. But what has also been important for accountability has been civil society mobilization. And here, the picture, I would say, is much less sunny. I think we've had closing space for civil society in a number of countries. We've had, during the pandemic agreement negotiations, very little space actually for civil society engagement, very limited transparency. And one of the big challenges is that many civil society groups have actually been funded by philanthropic organizations or others from the global north. This is now seen with increasing suspicion in a number of developing countries where there are prohibitions on that funding. But we have not yet seen new sources of financing to support NGOs coming from many countries where NGOs are very active and play an important role. I think this is a huge, huge crisis. We also see organizations like MSF that recently announced the closing of its Access to Medicines campaign, symbolizing a turning away from some of the political debates and decreasing its support actually for the kind of activism that we need. So I think there's a need to really reboot and reinvigorate support for civil society, financial, political, and otherwise. Maybe just one quick comment on the pandemic agreement before I run out of time. I think many of you who are following this have probably also been, who are in this webinar, have been following the pandemic agreement talks. And there are ways in which we've seen the traditional North-South divisions again coming up, especially around access to health technologies, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, age-old divisions and debates. But what I want to flag, picking up on my earlier theme, is that once you sort of scratch below the surface, I think it's actually not so simple, and that we have had the exertion of quite a lot of influence by developing countries, and that it is not a unified, countries are not always sharing the same views or interests, neither across the global south nor the global north, making the negotiations in some ways more complex and perhaps more difficult to reach agreement. So overall, I would say there are some reasons for optimism in terms of decreasing power inequalities in some ways. Power being exerted by countries that used to be very much on the periphery of the global system, including the Africa Group, for example. But at the same time, big concerns about the effectiveness of accountability mechanisms when civil society is being so systematically weakened. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suri, for a really helpful overview that I think has introduced some key themes around accountability from whom to whom, the role of civil society, and shifts in some of these traditional power structures and groupings that I think will set us up really nicely for our next three speakers and then into the Q&A. So thank you. And with that, Peter, I pass over to you.
Thank you, Emma. And I'd like to start by echoing what Suri had to say about congratulations on this webinar and on your strategy, and just say what a pleasure it is for me to be here with Sharifa and Yokling and Suri and yourself. You know, the two core concepts at the heart of our discussion are accountability and governance. And Suri very eloquently and elegantly said accountability from whom and to whom. And I'd like to complement that with a third question, which is for what? Accountability for what? And indeed, that's my central argument, which is that at the heart of accountability is accountability for results. And that WHO and the multilateral system will be more results-based and save more lives when its governing bodies demand this. And of course, the concept of governance, as you've defined it in your paper, is not limited to governing bodies of WHO or multilateral organizations, but it's not a bad idea to start there and clean your house from the inside out. You know, when I talk about results, I'm really talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And so those are globally agreed with lots of participation. And, you know, a short summary of the context, short technical summary of the context we're in now would be as follows. The progress on the SDGs sucks, and the geopolitics sucks. And if the progress on the SDGs suck and the geopolitics suck, then a really good way to approach this would be just to make sure we execute on what we've already agreed. Because we would never get an agreement like the SDGs or like the climate goals today. The execution has not been fantastic. The progress has not been fantastic. So one approach would be just to say, let's execute better on what we've already agreed. Unfortunately, what we see in global governance, and I'm looking at you, Summit of the Future and Pact for the Future, is bright, shiny object syndrome. We zero in on new things to be accountable for, as opposed to just focusing on executing better on what we've already agreed. So with that background, I want to just highlight three challenges before I end in terms of what does accountability for results actually mean. I had the privilege of coming to WHO with Dr. Tedros in 2017. And at the heart of his platform, and the reason I went with him, were four words: measurable impact in countries. And in pursuing that North Star, shall we say, you really face three hurdles, or we faced three hurdles. The first one was on outcomes. And that was about how do we know that the outcomes are good? And by outcomes, I'm really talking about the SDGs. The problem we faced was there's about 50 health-related SDGs out of 170 something in total, 169 in total, 140 with data. 50 health-related ones, 2/3 in SDG 3, 1/3 outside of SDG 3, and you can't do a strategy around 50 things. So we pulled them together into three things: healthier populations billion, universal health coverage billion, and health emergencies preparedness billion. And Dr. Tedros has reported on progress on those 3 billions every year to the World Health Assembly. GPW 14 kind of redid that a little bit with 100 indicators. And if you've got 100 indicators, you've got no indicators. But I think that'll all get sorted out in the wash. Anyway, the first hurdle is outcomes. And that's tractable, technically. That's point one. Point two is the second hurdle is, okay, well, those outcomes are the responsibility of countries primarily, and the multilateral system is there to help. So how do you know that the activities and the outputs of WHO or any of the other multilaterals are best supporting countries to drive those outcomes? Actually, the MOPAN report on WHO, released 2 days ago, earlier this week on Monday, said it's not very compelling. It's very hard to know how the activities and outputs of WHO actually drive those results in countries. But the irony is there is such a system that's been developed. It's called Delivery for Impact, which is very SDG based, talks about the things that WHO does to support countries to drive those outcomes. It's just not incorporated into the governance of WHO or into the program budget for that matter. So again, technically that hurdle has been solved, but from a governance standpoint, it certainly has not been solved. And then the third hurdle is the overall system and how the 13, 14, 15 multilateral agencies that are focused on health work together to support countries to promote the Sustainable Development Goals. And there have been three efforts to address that problem. The first was IHP+. The second was SDG 3 Global Action Plan. The third was Lusaka Agenda, Global Health, Future of Global Health Initiatives. And none of them adequately builds on the previous one. And they all kind of rise and fall. Again, there, technically, you can go to SDG 3 GAP and see a survey where the top public health official in 75 countries rated all the agencies on how well they're working together and how well they're following the national plan. So technically, the stuff, if you will, has been solved. This hurdle has been solved, but again, completely not incorporated into the governance and governing bodies of the agencies. So in summary, the point I want to make is that accountability for results is at the heart of the for what question of accountability. It's something we have a mutual interest in across the UN organizations, multilateral systems, civil society, because that translates into more lives saved and improved. That technically we can address these three concrete barriers in accountability for results. And the biggest gap now is that none of that information is really incorporated into governance or into governing bodies. And if you sit through a governing body of WHO or any of these other agencies, I'll speak about WHO, what happens there in the executive board or in the World Health Assembly is definitely not a focus on, okay, how are we doing on the SDGs? Dr. Tedros does report that, to be fair, but then what are we doing in WHO to help countries to drive that? Not much data about that. And then how are we doing in the whole system, in any of these governing bodies, to work together to make the synergies to help countries to drive that? So that's what could happen. And that won't happen until member states demand it through the governing bodies. And it seems to me that member states won't demand it until civil society colleagues demand member states to demand it. And that's what we're all doing here together. There's a natural tendency to ignore results because talk is fun and results are hard and people hate accountability. So the natural tendency is to ignore accountability for results. And unless we demand it and make member states demand it of the secretariats of these agencies, it ain't going to happen. And it seems to me that's a mutual agenda that every single person on this panel and probably on this webinar could share. So thank you very much again. And back to you, Emma.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think some important words of caution there around developing systems that we don't fully implement, and the dangers of chasing after the new. But before we unpack that anymore, I'm going to swiftly pass over to Sharifa.
Yeah, so thanks again, Emma and David, for inviting me, and also for this super important creating an agenda that I think is super important, especially in this moment. So I'm going to follow on from Suri and Peter and think about the role of law in the ways in which we construct kind of an accountability agenda. And I think I'm going to be less rosy, and I feel a bit like I am a lawyer with all the problems. I'm going to be less rosy than them and reflect on the ways in which the problems of global health, as Suri indicated, are so implicated within other treaties, within trade, for instance, within kind of the political economy, within governance, as Peter has said, and that creates such problems legally when you're trying to create accountability mechanisms. I'm going to particularly think about the role of corporations and foundations as barriers to creating this accountability that we might want to see. So I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and use those 5 minutes to illustrate two particular things that happened in the last pandemic that make me think really about these limitations of law and how governing health is not cohesive anymore because of these multiple agreements that create very different issues around both different regimes, but also create multiple actors. So pandemics, as we know, are governed by states. So we had really strong state responses in the last pandemic. But I think that particular things showed limitations in the approaches of thinking just about states in the ways in which pandemics are governed. So the first thing I'll talk about was supply chains for medical products. So when we think about supply chains for medical products, we have the international health regulations. They help us to think about how countries should stockpile medical products for the next pandemic. But actually, this is severely limited by the fact that many states are highly neoliberal, are being advised by lots of both either corporate actors or consultancy companies that are telling them there is no merit in stockpiling for the everyday. And so what's happening in reality is that many countries are actually relying on buying a huge number of a huge number of medical products within the context of a pandemic. So they are trying to buy them just in time when a pandemic occurs. And that, I think, is particularly problematic when you have private entities who are interested primarily in profit. They're thinking about charging countries as much as possible for these products. And that makes it really difficult for countries to buy these medical products within the context of pandemics. And so at the heart of this, you have a legal system that is actually prioritizing trade interests. So if you have the IHR, for instance, one of the things that it really thinks about is to prevent pandemics, but it also takes seriously the idea that you shouldn't stop trade within the context of these pandemics. And so in itself, the logic of these international health regulations is creating a model that justifies a just-in-time model so that we all buy our supplies during this pandemic. And this means that many countries, especially low and middle-income countries, are being charged extremely exorbitant prices during those pandemics, and that makes it critically difficult. And so when you think about this, you can say, well, it's about states, but actually you then have a third actor who's a private corporation who has no obligation under any of these international legal mechanisms, who's charging the highest price, and sometimes also, as we saw during the last pandemic, changing their minds. So say, telling country X, I will charge you this amount, and then changing their mind and giving it to a country that will pay a bit more. The second example around vaccines, I think, is more familiar. And I think here during COVID, we saw a huge push to have multilateral bargaining systems such as COVAX that would help all of us to purchase vaccines communally, and also ensure that every country in the world, no matter what, had at least some priority of getting these vaccines. However, again, we saw here that private companies were unwilling to cooperate within these organized systems. And what we saw was countries, especially low and middle income countries like South Africa and Uganda, paying over the odds for vaccines through restrictive contracts that limited that was kind of contrary to many of their international obligations within the legal system internationally. So for instance, we saw a Pfizer contract with South Africa that charged $10 a dose for vaccines, in comparison, for instance, to about $6 that were charged to other countries. And so you see there that these direct relationships between corporations and states during pandemics can be much more important than any multilateral efforts that we might have. And so even if we then kind of think the multilateral system will work, I think the other problem that we are left with is that countries can simply move out of the health system and go to the trade system, for instance. And when we try to have the trade waiver, the TRIPS waiver, where South Africa, India, Nigeria, we're trying really hard to get big pharmaceutical companies to waive their intellectual property rights and give the recipes for making vaccines to low and middle income countries. What we saw was countries voting with their pharmaceutical companies and therefore trying to restrict this. And so I think for me here, the picture of law being both kind of this enabler, but also a massive restrictor of the ways in which we get accountability is super important to be attentive to. And so if we want to achieve real change, we really need to think about the role of these bilateral agreements. We really need to think about the role of corporations in this space, but also private foundations, which are really acting against multilateralism in this space. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharifa. And I think a really interesting and important segue from the traditional way we think about global health governance as states and multilaterals to what happens as we see an increasing role for non-state actors. And I also think that's the perfect segue to our final speaker and the initial intervention before we move over to Q&As to talk about the vital role that civil society plays. So Yok-Ling, over to you.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thanks to UNU and the team and everybody on the panel. This is a great opportunity. Well, just following from what Sharifa said, as a lawyer and a person engaging in civil society spaces and with governments and parliamentarians, I have to say I am mostly quite negative, but I'm very optimistic because I don't give up. I mean, we all don't give up. That's why we're here. But just following from what has been said by our other colleagues on the panel, I think that, the multilateral norm setting and accountability through the agency of the member state has always been there, but it's never also been just states. I think we talk more about, involvement of different parts of society, but if you look at the national level, no government can achieve any of these results that we talk about if they do not engage society. So I think the natural, in a way, evolution of opening up spaces at the national level and local level, community groups, volunteers, I mean, that's been always part of delivery of health. And for many of us, who have been fortunate enough to have public health systems, that organizing of public health systems have also always involved the non-state part. So I don't think that we should look at global governance in today's complexity as something that is fighting back against, civil society or community participation, because all successes have been a more democratized health system delivery. I think the difference is that the lines in terms of accountability of the actors, when you have multi-stakeholderism, which is something that civil society and more, I think even governments who embraced it for a while are realizing that it's very messy, because as we have just heard, it actually does not draw any rules around accountability, around the fact that there's unequal power around the table. And I can always count, no matter how difficult, governance it is at the political level, at the national level, we can always hope as citizens that we can make a change, whether it's through elections or revolution, what have you. But how do I call for accountability of corporations or the huge foundations which are shaping health governance today in an unprecedented manner? When we have norms which are positive, I mean, we look, for example, the UN Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. This is one of the earliest WHO legally binding set of rules. And most unfortunately of our governments today have forgotten the obligations. For example, keeping the industry at arm's length is something that we would like to see in every sector: pharmaceutical, food, beverage, commercial, milk subsidies, etc. So there is this kind of confusion, and I would say, in a way, unfortunately, it started with SG Kofi Annan, when he realized, when he became Secretary General in the UN, that so much of the power of wealth has been shifted to the private sector. And that's through the neoliberalism that we talked about just now. And once you wake up and you say, oh, a lot of the money, because we've reduced taxes in the OECD, et cetera, so we need to go to the money and get the money to help us solve the problem. But the wealth concentration in private corporations across all sectors, and pharmaceuticals, we saw it very, very clearly, also they started influencing rules. The TRIPS Agreement on Intellectual Property is a direct result, and was basically written by Pfizer and their friends, right? We know that is well documented. So the norms in terms of the clash between multilateral member state public health driven norms and the new norms in trade and in finance and investment that is about corporate control and corporate expansion with no accountability, that clash is where we see governance getting into deep sort of trouble. So we need to unpack this, and I think the discussion we're having helps us to do that. But just think, Pfizer's average annual revenue is about 50 billion. During the 2 years in 2021, 2022, because of the vaccine, it doubled to 80 billion and 100 billion. This is one company. You think about that, all right? The commercial milk industry is about 55 billion a year. You think about states and their revenue, and how we are even doing less and less of public taxation, because we are told that's not the way to go because states are inefficient. So I think we need to really look at what is public, what is private, who the players are, and we need to really look at how civil society spaces are closed in many ways, but the spaces for corporations are getting more and more open, and a lot of it is not transparent. So the conflict of interest policy in governance is absolutely crucial. Many of us fought for conflict of interest policy when we looked at the framework for the engagement of non-state actors in the WHO, but the conflict of interest policy mechanisms have not been worked out as we had expected it to. So we have unfinished business on that. Many of us took the experience in the WHO and took it to the treaty bodies, like the Convention on Biological Diversity has a conflict of policy and mechanisms which are very, very interesting and workable, and has been tested recently by civil society and indigenous peoples communities. And so we need to look at that and do that cross-linking across treaty bodies. And just to end, very interestingly, because of the COVID inequities, a number of the networks around Families for People's Vaccine, we decided to go to the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and use the CEDAW treaty body review process to hold to accountability a number of countries, including Denmark, Germany, Sweden, and their positions in the EU on the TRIPS waiver. So, and these are the ways we actually can use those norms to get to the results. But in the end, WHO is not about implementation. It's about norm setting and protecting the public space. Let's give the means of implementation back to the societies. And what we see, as I think, Peter, you mentioned very clearly, there is not only a stepping back away from legal commitments across all UN multilateral agreements, whether it's climate, whether it's health, there's also starving of the means of implementation. And so when we do that, and then we get people into debt, so the summit of the future for many of us is not about something new and glamorous. It's about recalling what are the fundamental flaws in the global system. And the fact that the SG has identified the international financial architecture, which is built to be unequal. So we're not surprised it is unequal, because it's doing very well as an unequal system. How do we break that? Because it is in the economic sphere that we will be able to liberate really finally what is public health, if we do it right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yokling, for what is always, whenever we speak to you, a really invigorating intervention that gets us thinking. Now, as Tiffany has mentioned in the chat, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A box to share with us. For now, I'm going to draw on some of the questions and ideas that were shared with us in the pre-webinar registrations. And I'd like to pick up on this idea of how much the system has changed and the role for different actors and its impact on global health. So, we see change both within the broader governance system, increasing globalization, but we also see massive technological disruptions, all of which have impacts on health. So I wondered, how are our global health governance systems responding to these changes? And are our existing mechanisms fit for purpose? I feel like I've heard a bit of a mixed response to that already, but I'd like to come to Sharifa first, because I know you've been doing some really interesting work in the digital space.
Yeah, so thanks. So I kind of will spend, in some ways, digitization has radical potential to change health systems. We see this everywhere. You can use less resource, have more use less resource, have more people see doctors through telemedicine. We saw a lot of that potential when COVID came, both in high income and low and middle income countries. But I think one of the things that we are not as attentive to is, I think that there are three things that we're not attentive to. I think one is the way in which health data has become a tool of extraction. And this is like across the board. The second one is a reorganization of health systems, where we have companies that are not even health companies. So these are digital companies getting hugely involved in health systems. And I think that's really problematic, because they have a very different ethos. They don't necessarily care about health systems. They're just kind of thinking about data and extraction. And the third is the role of the state in all of this, where, again, these corporations are just kind of displacing the state in many ways. And I think one of the things that concerns me as a person who thinks about law a lot is the replication of some of the problems around, for instance, pharmaceuticals, that these companies own all the intellectual property around. So they own the hardware, they own the software, they own the storage of where this data is going. And so that's like deeply problematic, as we've seen with vaccines. And so that really sets us up. And the second thing is that there is at the moment no international legal mechanism to really think through how digitization of health is both working, but also is holding any of these corporations accountable. There are some mechanisms beginning to emerge. So some people thinking about human rights, for instance, trying to think about human rights within the WHO. I think the UN is doing some work on AI and governance, but my worry is that it's too slow, it's too reactive. And in the meantime, this idea that this is disruptive, it's going on whether we want it or not, is creating a sense of huge amounts of experimentation in low and middle income countries, which will be very hard to roll back on in the future.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on a point on that. And this question is going to go to all panelists. So kind of wave at me if you feel invigorated to respond. We had a question submitted us that was asking about how governance and accountability can help turn the tide towards a greater focus on global public goods when it seems like we're going in the opposite direction. And kind of I've picked up on this because, Sharifa, you talked about kind of digitization and the marketization of data and of health as something as a tool for capitalism. So I wondered, Peter, I see you've unmuted. Suri, I see you have too. So maybe I'll come to Peter first. I'd love to hear your reflections on this.
Sure. And I think what I have to say actually picks up nicely from what Sharifa said and is responsive to both questions. First thing to remember is that innovation is not only science and technology and products, like, say, a COVID vaccine, but it's also social and service delivery innovations. And Yokling was getting very close to that in her comments. It's also digital innovation, which Sharifa was talking about, and it's financial innovation. Let me take a concrete example of how innovation and governance could fit together to give you results. And that concrete example is mental health. 95% of people with mild to moderate mental health problems, depression and anxiety around the world don't get treatment. That's the 90-10, maybe it's 90%, 90-10 treatment gap. So innovative models are needed to speed up that SDG, that health outcome. Dixon Chibanda, a psychiatrist in Zimbabwe, developed something called the Friendship Bench, a well-known example, where grandmothers provide cognitive behavioral therapy, culturally adapted to the Shona culture, to people with mild to moderate disorders. Randomized trials shows that it benefits them. So then the question is, how does that scale? Dixon can work to scale it within Zimbabwe, but how does it scale across, say, 100 countries? That should be the job of multilaterals. The most useful thing a multilateral could do in the context of innovation is to take models that are working in one country and help innovators and governments across 50 countries to scale them. Imagine if that example, or a couple of others I could give you, of social service delivery innovations were effectively scaled. They've currently scaled to hundreds of thousands of people. Imagine if you were to focus on those innovations scaled to hundreds of thousands of people, and through the multilaterals, scaled them to tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, working with governments around the world, with civil society around the world. That is what the multilateral system should be doing. And that's what the governance of these agencies should be demanding what they do. It's absolutely what they don't do, especially not in social innovation. Arguably, in products, maybe they do, maybe they don't. We could have a discussion about that. In social service delivery innovations, for sure, they do not do what I just described. So there's a concrete example, I think, Emma, of how governance and innovation could come together to make results. And could I just mention that a lot of these ideas I've developed on my blog at singerp.substack.com, and would be very glad to stay in touch with people through singerp.substack.com. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I think really interesting to think about the role of multilaterals actually as potential important preservers of health as a public good, and kind of that interface with the corporates. Suri, I'm going to come over to you because there's still quite a few questions to get to. So over to you.
Thanks very much. No, I agree, Peter, with what you said, that there's huge scope for increasing uptake of social and other kinds of innovation, and that scope hasn't yet been realized. But I think that there are many situations where control over technologies, control over innovative technologies, remains too limited. And I wanted to pick up on some themes that both Sharifa and Yokling raised about indeed who controls technologies. I think if we look at the example of both COVID-19 vaccines, but in fact, most, if not all, pandemic-related technologies, they benefit tremendously from public investment. And the reason is that the private sector does not find them, that they're generally too risky or not profitable enough for the private sector. What I see as a big problem is that governments today need to up their game. I think governments, in fact, are not living up to their responsibilities to regulate private firms. Governments are not living up to the power that they already have through the public purse to insist on more pro-social outcomes, like attaching access conditions to R&D funding. And when we look at some of the pandemic agreement negotiations, this has been one of the most contentious issues. Will governments commit through a pandemic agreement to do exactly that, to say when we give money to private firms to conduct R&D, or through advanced market commitments, we give money to private firms to ramp up production capacity, do we insist that that money comes with some strings attached that will protect the public interest, or do we just, give it away? And unfortunately, governments have been very hesitant to make that commitment to each other. And so I agree that there has been this rise of private power. But to me, the way to govern that private power is for governments to do their job in regulating and using both the legal power they have as well as the economic power they have, which is quite considerable, to in fact do what they are supposed to do vis-a-vis private firms. And this is not just governments in high-income countries. When we look at some of the top 50 companies, pharmaceutical companies by market capitalization, many of them are actually now Chinese. And I don't mean to only focus on China here. I just think it's a remarkable shift. But I think this will also change. We have some Indian firms as well. So it's not only a north-south situation or a public-private situation. It's kind of a complex mix of both. So I do think there's a need to pressure, but also capacitate governments to do what they're supposed to do vis-a-vis private authority and private firms. And that also requires governments to work more closely with each other, especially when dealing with multinational entities. And unfortunately, we don't see nearly as much of that, I think, today as we need to in this globalized context.
Thank you. Yokling, I'm going to come straight to you.
Yeah, I think it's more than that. They're not doing what they should do as a state being responsible and regulating. It's worse than that. They're actually aligning many of these governments with the private corporate interests. So if you really look at the pharmaceutical industry, agribusiness, and the whole debate around DSI, digital data, and in the pandemic treaty itself. So it's that active alignment, of representing the interests of the big industry. So it's not something that, we're not aware, therefore we'll do it. It's much more, I think, insidious than that, because they have been captured. We talk about the UN capture all the time, but really it's government capture by corporations and banks. I mean, BlackRock is more powerful than any other financing institution in the world today. And they're everywhere, whether you like it or not, you don't even know. So I think that's really what we're talking about, that level of accountability is deep and they are so influential. For example, if you look at, remember in 2018, when we were looking, when I was working with David on the breastfeeding issues for the Lancet series. And then, then we recall in 2018, when Ecuador moved in the WHO to have a resolution to promote and protect breastfeeding, the United States was dead against it. Why? Because of the corporate interests involved, right? And in the end, it was a much diluted thing. So it's not that we don't want to move towards getting implementation and results. We are fighting at the multilateral level to even keep the norms that are positive that we're so hard fought for the last 80 years. And we see this very clearly. When we try to use our right under what's left, in the TRIPS agreement to issue compulsory licensing, to have strict patentability criteria so we don't just keep giving patents in a very responsible way, you get a lot of pressure from the pharma industry and the US Embassy and the USTR. I'm sitting in Malaysia, we constantly have this pressure when we try to exercise our rights in international law. So I think that is something that we really need to be upfront about. And so it's not to wait for them to be good, but that they are actually captured. And I think that's a democratic issue. It's an issue of accountability in the North and in the countries which are becoming bigger in the South as well. Yes, across the board. I think that's the big challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we come into the final 10 minutes of this discussion, I'm going to ask each of you to keep your kind of responses and interventions quite pithy. I really want to pick up on the idea of money. It is a cliche that money is power. Yokling, you just talked about the role of private investment. And in the opening story, you talked about the shrinking support that's available for civil society because of, his understandable reticence at times or concerns about the influence that the money of private foundations can have when actors from the global north are funding institutions in the south. But Yokling, as a CSO, there are costs associated with representing your voice in all these different multilateral spaces. And I just wondered, what is your experience of kind of enabling environments that facilitate citizens and actors to have a voice and affect their rights?
I think civic space is always going to be contested and there will be ups and downs. We have moments where, given the political situation in the country and who wins the election, things can shift, right? And I think so it's never a linear good and bad. It's ups and downs. And a lot of what happens in our lives are also very much determined by externalities and now geopolitics. So for civil society groups working across public health and any other field, we used to try to avoid politics directly, let alone geopolitics. It's not our area, especially those who are doing much more the kind of service delivery and then beginning to get into advocacy and doing policy work. But we can't run away from that. I think that's the one thing for us today, civil society groups and coalitions, we have to navigate those political and geopolitical realities. And that is not easy because there are contradictions. There's always been contradictions. I can work very closely with certain governments at the international level, but at home, we will be having a lot of confrontation and we call them to accountability, and that's part of life. So I think we can expect contradictions, we can expect tensions, but I think there is a shift in my own personal experience. Even when we go up and down, and of course, external funding is always a very vulnerable spot, right? If you have governments and politicians, I don't use the word government too generally, politicians, they can always pick and choose anything. Even WHO can be accused of being nasty and bad, and we contested space everywhere. But I think that but overall, the maturity, the ability to communicate, the transparency of what we do has really gone way up. And I see what I'm so encouraged by, and I'll just stop there after this, is the number of young people on every issue. Because in the 80s, we lost them to MBAs and Wall Street, equivalent in all our countries. And neoliberalism was so powerful. And a lot of worst rules we have in trade, investment, and intellectual property came from that era. But this generation, they are not overwhelmed by climate change or global health pandemics or whatever. They want to fight. They have the energy, and they want mentoring. They want information analysis. And I don't like it when people say young people do not want to read. Of course they want to read. We just have to communicate differently. I know lots of young people who are diving into thick reports once they get excited by the TikTok part of it, right? So that's for me the optimism. We will have to always never take it for granted. Now, the financing is a challenge. Many of us, through circumstances in the South, had to rely on part of progressive ODA or progressive foundations, and that is threatened. So we need to really think about how we're going to do our work. And many of us are also in countries where we are also challenging our own states and institutions to say we have money in the country, that money also needs to go support, not just philanthropy, but civic participation. So that's the kind of what we will need to do as well. Not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but we will need to do that too.
Thanks, Yok-Ling. And that's a perfect segue, actually, as I think about TikTok and getting people excited and giving them the right stuff to exert their voice. We had a question before the webinar that asked, how can we consciously engage with these global dynamics, which can feel very abstract, and bring them to life with our own lives and workplaces, and all contribute to accountability and governance. And so I'm going to ask, Yok-Ling, I won't come to you in the interests of time, because I think I got a great answer from you already, but I'm going to come to Sharifa and then Peter and then Suri to see if you can share one thing that you think people or organizations can do to make the very conceptual practical. Sharifa.
Yeah. So I think very quickly, so I think I agree with Yok-Ling that education, so like the youth is super important. But also, I think for me, the biggest thing is to just not be discouraged. So I listened to this really fascinating thing where it was like, capital is so good at reorganizing, at reimagining itself, and we get dispirited. We lose one battle and then we think it's the end of the world. And I think that what we must do is to constantly re-engage, reorganize, use the frameworks that we have of human rights and other frameworks, and create coalitions of people who are willing to fight, and we can do this.
Thank you so much. Peter.
Thank you. Whatever organization you're in, every organization in some way contributes to our mutual interest in progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And whatever your organization you're in, demand accountability for progress on whatever Sustainable Development Goal your organization is focused on. And all of us have an interest in the multilateral system and the UN system. And so we can all demand accountability from WHO and UN actors and multilateral actors for results. And to get one step more granular on that, Emma, very quickly, My observation is that in the first year of a mandate of a leader, because leadership really matters in the multilateral system, you can almost do anything. In the 9th or 10th year of a mandate, you can almost do nothing. And that's a function of bureaucracies. And in 3 years, I think Dr. Tedros has done a lot on accountability for results. More can be done. But in 3 years, there's a director general election. Focus hard on that when it gears up in 2 years' time. And ask yourself which of these candidates can best deliver over the next 10 years on accountability for results, can deliver results. And I think that is a mutual interest that we all share, because those results mean more women will survive, more children will survive, more people will survive and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And Suri.
Thanks very much. Before I get to a point of practical optimism, I want to flag one concern that we didn't have time to touch on because it's such a huge theme, which is an increasing concern of mine, and that's what I would call the rise of billionaire governance. And it's not necessarily about foundations or firms, it's about individuals who are so insanely and obscenely wealthy that they themselves are individual governors at the global level. I think this is hugely problematic and hugely anti-democratic. But coming to a more optimistic and practical note, what I want to say is that I think small NGOs or, we had a question about academics, organizations, what can they do? I would never underestimate the butterfly effect. And this is coming straight out of theories about complex systems, complex adaptive systems, that small actions can have very large effects elsewhere in the system, and that it's not always easy to predict that. And as an example, I actually want to give Third World Network, not only because Yokling is here on the call, but Third World Network, as many people know, is not a massive organization. It doesn't have, the staff of Médecins Sans Frontières, but the effects that you guys have and the influence that you have is really punching far, far above your weight, I would say, in terms of number of staff or budget. And whenever a new version of the pandemic treaty drops, people say, what does CWN think? What have they written about this? And it's not, just the person, an average person who asked me. These are negotiators. These are people in the Secretariat. So the influence is really tremendous. And I say that because I think organizations that know their work, that know their issues, that have a reputation, that are trusted, you can have a tremendous impact without being big in the traditional sense. And I think there's a lot of lessons and inspiration to be taken from the organizations that do it well now.
Thank you so much. And as we come into the final minute, I just want to say kind of a big thank you to all the panelists and to the really active conversation in the chat. There were so many more topics that we could have touched on today, and I'm sad only that we've run out of time. But we will be having one more discussion in this series in 3 weeks' time on the 18th of July, and that will delve even more into this idea of the practical. It will be moderated by my colleague, Penelope Milson at IIGH, and she will be having a fantastic panel of institutions and individuals that are affecting or serve as accountability mechanisms. So we'll be showcasing case studies that illustrate a range of mechanisms, from vertical fund observers to civil society tribunals. So maybe perhaps a way to hold some of these corporate actors to account. And we'll talk a little bit both how they can reinforce, but also disrupt, but also reinforce some of these powerful asymmetries. And again, we'll try and have an emphasis on actionable steps, and we'll discuss some of the promising and less promising practices for leveraging accountability. So please do register. The link is in the chat. And with that, it just leaves me to say, I hope you all have a fabulous rest of the day, wherever you are. And thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.